Have you ever had a patient walk into your clinic and think, this case doesn't make any sense? They're exhausted, but they're also wired. They're complaining of insomnia, irritability, heat symptoms, and at the same time, they're also exhibiting cold signs like poor digestion and fatigue. They've already tried everything, supplements, functional medicine, diet protocols, and endless lab work. And yet they still feel like their nervous system is stuck in overdrive while their energy keeps collapsing. These are some of the most frustrating cases in clinic because the symptoms, they're not following the clean patterns we were taught in school. But nearly 800 years ago, a physician named Li Dongyuan, also known as Li Gao, described a mechanism that explains this paradox almost perfectly. He called it Yin-Fire. And what's remarkable with his description of Yin-Fire is that it maps very closely onto what we now understand about neurotransmitters. The model I'm going to walk through here today is my attempt to translate Li Dongyuan's clinical insights to modern neurophysiology. In this video, we're going to be looking at what Yin-Fire actually is, how it develops in chronic fatigue, and why understanding it can completely change how we approach these difficult cases in clinic. Because once you understand the mechanism that's behind Yin-Fire, many of these seemingly contradictory symptoms suddenly become very clear. If you've treated fatigue patients for long enough, this pattern probably feels familiar. Hi, I'm Paul Rooney, licensed and board certified acupuncturist and founder of Neurological Acupuncture of New Hampshire, where I combine the convenience of house calls with the gentle effectiveness of more than 28 years of acupuncture experience. Let's jump in. To understand Yin-Fire, it helps to start with what we're actually seeing in clinic. These patients are often presenting with a very confusing mix of symptoms. On the one hand, they're showing heat signs and complain of things like irritability, headaches, poor sleep, thirst, and feeling overheated. But at the same time, they're also showing clear signs of deficiency cold. The bloating, loose stools, cold hands and feet, cold easily, and fatigue. The clinical picture looks contradictory. The patient appears both hot and cold at the same time. And this is exactly the pattern Li Dongyuan was trying to explain. His key insight is that the root of this problem in many of these patients is damage to the spleen and stomach. When the middle jiao becomes weak from overwork, chronic illness, excessive thinking, or poor diet, the body gradually loses its ability to transform food into usable energy. In other words, qi production begins to fail. Once that happens, the body starts to lose its normal physiological organization. In classical language, the spleen is responsible for raising clear yang upward to the brain and sensory organs. But when the spleen qi collapses, that upward movement weakens. The system becomes disorganized. And this is where the next step of the mechanism begins. Li described a type of metabolic activity in the body called ministerial fire. Under healthy conditions, this fire remains rooted in the lower body, supporting metabolism and physiological activity. But when the qi collapses, the middle system weakens, and that fire loses its anchor. Instead of remaining stable, it begins to float upward. This is what Li called Yin-Fire. So the heat symptoms that we see in patients aren't coming from excess fuel. They're coming from a fire that has lost its root. Meanwhile, the underlying systems responsible for producing energy, especially digestion and qi generation, they continue to weaken, which is why these patients show the pattern we see so often. Heat in the upper jiao, deficiency in the middle and lower. The upper burner shows agitation, insomnia, and heat sensations. The middle burner showing fatigue, digestive weakness, and cold. Heat rises, cold sinks. This combination is what makes these cases feel so complex in clinic because the symptoms look like several different patterns going on at the same time. But through the lens of Yin-Fire, they begin to make sense. The system isn't simply hot or cold. It's lost its regulatory center. And when that center weakens, the fire rises while the foundation declines. What's fascinating is if we translate the mechanism into modern neurophysiology, the pattern Li described looks very similar to what we now understand as a cascade of neurotransmitter dysregulation. In other words, the rising Yin-Fire he observed clinically corresponds closely to what happens when the nervous system begins to lose its regulatory balance. This first stage of the cascading process often begins with rising excitatory signaling to the brain, particularly through glutamate. Glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter of the nervous system. Under normal conditions, excitatory signals are carefully balanced by the inhibitory systems that keep the brain stable and responsive. But when metabolic regulation begins to weaken, especially in states of chronic stress, overwork, or illness, glutamate signaling can gradually begin to rise. Patients often experience this as sensory cognitive overload. They report difficulty concentrating, racing thoughts, poor sleep, and increased sensitivity to stimulation. As excitatory signaling rises, the brain normally relies on inhibitory buffering to maintain stability. The most important inhibitory neurotransmitter in the system is GABA. GABA acts as the braking system for neural activity. As excitatory pressure continues to increase, this inhibitory buffering begins to weaken. When this happens, patients often feel restless but exhausted. They may be unable to relax even though they're deeply fatigued. They're wired but tired. The next system that begins to destabilize is the norepinephrine system, particularly the regulatory activity of the locus coeruleus. Norepinephrine plays a central role in attention, vigilance, and stress responsiveness. When this system shifts into a dysregulated state, patients often develop symptoms that strongly resemble the rising fire described by Li. These common signs are including irritability, sweating, stress sensitivity, and hyperalertness. Over time, maintaining this hyperaroused state becomes very metabolically expensive for the brain. And this is where the next stage of the cascade begins. The dopamine system. It governs motivation and sustained effort, and it begins to lose stability. At this point, patients are often describing a very characteristic experience. They can mobilize for short bursts of energy for a short period of time, but sustained effort becomes extremely difficult. Activity is followed by rapid crashes, and the ability to maintain motivation gradually declines. As this cascade continues, additional systems begin to show signs of strain. Serotonin regulation becomes unstable. Acetylcholine signaling begins to weaken. Endorphin systems temporarily buffering stress, but they can't sustain the load indefinitely. At the same time, neuroimmune activation can also begin to increase levels of substance P, contributing to inflammation and pain sensitivity. At this stage, the patient's nervous system is no longer operating in a stable regulatory state. Instead, it's entered a pattern of progressive dysregulation, where excitatory pressure and metabolic demand and neurotransmitter instability are reinforcing one another. And this is why the clinical picture of chronic fatigue can become so complex. Multiple systems appear to be malfunctioning at the same time. But if we take a step back and look at the sequence, the pattern becomes clear. The nervous system is gradually losing its ability to regulate itself, which brings us right back to Li's original insight. What he called Yin-Fire is not simply excess heat. It is the physiological consequence of regulatory systems collapsing while metabolic demand continues to rise. These cases often become confusing in clinic. The practitioner sees heat signs first. The patient has insomnia, irritability, red cheeks, maybe a red tongue tip. From there, it's very easy to conclude, the root is kidney yin deficiency. But the problem with that interpretation is that it's giving too much weight to the heat signs while overlooking the broader pattern, because these patients are also presenting with low appetite, bloating, fatigue after eating, loose stools, cold hands and feet, and a rest that isn't restful. And that combination matters. Li's point is that the root is often not a failure of the kidney yin to contain the fire. The root is spleen deficiency. More specifically, it's the weakening of the middle burner and the loss of its regulatory control. When the middle is strong, it transforms and transports properly. It generates qi, it raises the clear, and it maintains order. But when that middle weakens, that regulatory function begins to fail. Once that happens, the system begins to lose its inhibitory control. In Western terms, this is the point where the buffering systems, they begin to break down. The nervous system becomes more unstable, more reactive, more hyperexcitable. In Li Dongyuan's language, ministerial fire loses its root. So the heat signs are real, but they're not telling you that the system has too much fuel. They're telling you that the system has lost control over the flame. That distinction is crucial because if we misread these patients as primarily kidney yin deficient and treat only the heat at the top, we can actually miss the root of the problem. The center remains weak. Digestion remains poor. Qi production remains impaired, and the pattern continues. This is why Yin-Fire is such a valuable clinical idea. It helps us recognize what it looks like. It's not just a simple heat picture, but actually a regulatory collapse rooted in the middle jiao. So how did Li Dongyuan approach this Gordian knot? He came up with what was a radical idea, and he summarized it with a simple phrase: sweet and warm eliminates heat. At first glance, it sounds counterintuitive. If a patient is showing heat symptoms, irritability, insomnia, flushing, it might seem logical to use cold herbs to clear heat. But Li argued that doing so in these cases often makes the situation worse because the root of the problem is not excess heat. The root is weakness of the middle burner. When digestion and qi production are impaired, the body loses its ability to regulate itself, and once that regulatory center weakens, the system begins to destabilize. Ministerial fire loses its root and rises upward. So instead of trying to suppress that heat directly, Li Dongyuan focused on restoring the center, strengthening the spleen, rebuilding qi production, and reestablishing the normal movement of clear yang. When the middle system recovers, regulation improves, clear yang rises again, and ministerial fire becomes anchored. As that regulatory stability returns, the heat begins to resolve on its own. As he wrote in the Pi Wei Lun, the sweet and warm eliminates heat. This is why the formulas such as Buxiang Yiqiwan became central in treating these kinds of patterns. The goal is not simply to tonify deficiency, it's to restore the body's regulatory center so the system can stabilize itself. This is what makes Li's concept of Yin-Fire so powerful. It describes the same pattern we explored earlier through the lens of modern neurophysiology. In classical language, the middle burner weakens, qi production declines, and ministerial fire loses its root. In modern terms, the regulatory system of the nervous system begins to destabilize. Excitatory signaling rises, inhibitory buffering weakens. Stress chemistry becomes unstable, and over time, the systems responsible for sustained energy begin to collapse. Two different languages, but they're describing the same physiological pattern. And that insight, it changes how we approach these patients. When someone presents with this kind of fatigue, the solution isn't simply to try to push the system harder or try to force more energy into it. The goal is to restore regulation, strengthen the center, stabilize the system, and the body's natural regulatory mechanism will regain control. When this happens, the fire settles, the nervous system becomes more stable, and deeper energy systems have a time and opportunity to rebuild. If this pattern sounds familiar to what you or someone you care about may be experiencing, acupuncture can often be very helpful in restoring that balance. So if you'd like to explore that further, you're welcome to reach out to me at Neurological Acupuncture of New Hampshire for either in-person treatments or video consultations. Thank you for listening, and please leave any questions that you might have in the comments below, and I'll be answering them personally. Have a great day.